Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Corporate Services meeting. We have a exhilarating agenda for you this afternoon. There is, I'll look for disclosures of pecuniary interest. Don't have any. Okay, so we have 4 consent items. Does anyone want any of those pulled? Councillor?
Number 2.
Number 2.
That was mine as well.
Okay, so could I have a motion on 3, 4, and 5?
Yeah, just some brief comments on all 3 of these items. On the number 3, the establishing a tax ratio for new multi-unit residential. Happy to see us moving forward on this. I know the province essentially requires that we do it through regulation, but we got to pick the tax ratio. I'm glad to see we're going with 1.0 rather than say 1.1. I think it's, as is articulated in the report, it keeps us competitive with other municipalities that have established those ratios and probably will be over the course of the next year as they all start to comply with the regulations. On number 4, I appreciate this report. I think it's very helpful to have it broken out specifically and to look at the details of the capital and operating leases. I do think it's important to stress that when you see the increases year over year, it's probably because we entered into a long-term lease, 1 or more of them, and that we're reporting the total value of those commitments. And I think that's helpful. It's broken out in the actual report, but for members of the public who are reading it, it's not as though we're spending more money. It's that we're entering in and renewing leases and other leases are expiring. And on number 5, I support the idea of disposing of this particular parcel. I'm interested to see what happens in terms of if there's a zoning amendment that comes forward at planning around this property or what have you, but I don't see a real need for the city to retain that particular parcel. And I had a question for our staff just on that one, whether this parcel was retained and held by the city for this specific purpose about creating the access into the property on Huron. I just wonder if they could address that.
Bill?
Through the chair, yes, this was, parcel was acquired through a condition of subdivision approval on the surrounding subdivision. And so it was a legal requirement for the city to retain it until such time as the adjoining lands are developed, and it would provide for a secondary access to those lands if they are developed.
And I see our transportation staff here, which is great because I was wondering, is the idea to have a primary access off of Huron Street and then a secondary access onto Redwood Lane? Is that the idea?
Mr. Soldo?
Thank you, through the chair, to the councillor. The primary access based on the classification of streets in this area would be off of Huron Street. And secondary, if required, would be off the street into the back.
Anything further on those items? Councillor Morgan?
Yes, I don't have anything to add. I think Councillor Helmer spoke well. I just want to point out that Councillor Helmer and I are 2 of 3 members of the committee, and this is going to be the quickest time we pass something with tax ratios is the title, so everybody can rest at ease. I think it's a good policy as well. I think 1.0 is a good number to set it at.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question through to staff. I'm pleased with this as well. I also note that we've got some DC tax grants in the downtown area for multi-residential housing, and I wonder if this will have an impact on those.
Any impact on the DC grants in the downtown?
Through the chair, this should not, this is just the classification for as they're built, how they move forward. So this would be completely independent of any other process for that.
Okay, thank you. So that we would they would be calculated at a lower rate then?
Through the chair, what this does is, this is new legislation that has come in that the province is now regulating, that for new multi-residential buildings that are built from that date forward, they will now be taxed at that different classification, which means that based on the tax ratios, they will now be more to basically in line as a residential rate, as opposed to a different multi-residential rate, which has a different valuation.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the contemplation of a long discussion on tax rates for multi-residential caused Councillor Park and Councillor Usher to go to the SCM board meeting, so. Call the question.
Motion carries 3-0.
Okay, item number 2, I'm sure we're all quite excited about this because it's foreshadowing a couple of elections. Actually, in the 2018-19, we'll probably have 3 elections in a period of about 12 months or thereabouts. So I think Councillor Helmer, you pulled this, and I'll let you start.
So first I have what I think would be just a small technical issue that I think might need to resolve, which is in the bylaw, it talks about restricting signs just to the ward that a person is in, and that's not going to be relevant for people who are not campaigning in wards. So if they're campaigning in an electoral district that is, say, London Fanshawe, London North Centre, they're not operating in wards, and I think we need to have some language there that is more generic, or perhaps just more specific, to say ward or electoral district. So I'm not sure if our staff have language that would fix that, but I think the intention is to restrict signs for provincial and federal campaigns as well, so that they're just in the ridings that they're campaigning in. It's frankly not as big of a problem with provincial and federal campaigns, but I do think it's worth having the restriction for all.
Ms. Saunders, you want to comment on that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we did have a discussion with the councillor beforehand, so we thank him for bringing that to our attention. And we're recommending some amendments to the bylaw so that there's a revised bylaw before council, which would include a definition of an electoral district, which means a geographic area represented by a member of municipal council, member of school board, member of provincial parliament in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, and a member of the federal parliament in the House of Commons. And then add to the bylaw, no person shall place or permit to be placed an election sign outside of the electoral district where the candidate is running for office. And an additional section that says that section 2.4, which is the section I just read you, does not apply to an election sign within 50 meters of any electoral district that is adjacent to the electoral district where the candidate is running for office. So that responds to, I believe, those concerns.
Thank you. That's very straightforward and easy. Hopefully my colleagues will support that particular change. My second question is around nomination day, and it's something I want to raise for discussion with my colleagues. I know that it's been in the proposed bylaw for quite some time. It was there in February, I believe. And I want to make sure everyone understands what the nomination day is, because I think the plain reading of it is to think that it's the beginning of the campaign period. It's not the beginning of the campaign period. I believe it's the 4th Friday in July. And so it's the end of the nomination period. And so what we're saying in the bylaw is to say that signs can't go up until the end of the nomination period, where the last day you could file. I think that's still providing plenty of time. You still have all of August, September, and most of October for signs to be up. But it is perhaps different than what people are expecting when they just read the word. I think when they think nomination day, they might think it's the first day you could nominate rather than the last. So I wanted to hear from my colleagues what they think about that.
Councillor Morgan, on that point and others.
Well, I'm happy to engage in that discussion. I did have a couple of questions myself. I'd like to ask, that way we can kind of get everything out and then have a discussion back and forth with all of the colleagues on the committee as well as those who are in attendance today. The question I had, at least the first question I had was, within the definition of site triangle, which is something we talked about last time. And I see that it's a 7-meter triangle, and the definition is much clearer on how to measure that. But one of the suggestions that I had raised, and my concern was for those intersections that have rounded corners, of which there are many in the city, determining the 7-meter point of the triangle would require you to kind of find that point where the two roads intersect, which requires you to kind of walk out on the street if someone was going to be, you know, detailed enough to want to actually measure where they're, you know, where they're able to put their signs. And I was concerned that that provided some safety concerns with campaigns potentially walking out on the street to determine where, you know, this triangle actually starts, where the point, the 90-degree point is on the triangle, which would be essentially on the street in some cases where, like I said, we have many rounded roads. The alternative to this was to have it off of the curb a certain number of meters, and I know that we settled on, or at least the report settled on, sticking with the triangle. I wonder if there was any rationale for doing the triangle as opposed to, say, 3 meters off the curb, which may cover a similar effective area as the site triangle, and accomplish the same thing, which we already have another section of this that says, you know, 3 meters off the point of the road. So that was a question that I'd raised last time. I'm just wondering if it was discussed, and I don't mind asking other questions if a little more time is needed with that one as well.
Kathy or Sarah?
Through Mr. Chair, we did elaborate in the draft bylaw a bit more for clarification of site triangle. And it's now measured from the roadway, which is the travel portion of the road, instead of from the lot line that divides the lot from the road. So there's a bit more room there to do some measurement, but yes, there may be times where that person may have to go to the road, but that's kind of why we looked at roadway instead of the property line.
I still have some concerns about that. Now, I don't want to send this whole thing back again and figure out the math of what would be the same coverage coming off the curb. So an alternative to this is moving forward with this bylaw as it stands, and in the training for candidates, which I know is provided by our clerk's office, is to be very clear about the safe ways to determine how to place signs properly. And I think if we want to emphasize that and provide that to campaigns and candidates as part of the orientation and the training that happens during elections, we can ensure that people who are trying to put up signs within the bylaw are doing so in as safe a possible way as they can. Because that's my primary concern with a point that intersects on the roadway, is to make sure that people can actually do what's right, follow the law in a safe way. And I just don't want people measuring off of a road where traffic is going, because I just don't think that's a good thing. Your attention is focused elsewhere. So if we can try to deal with that in the training, I think we can move forward with this. As an election happens, if this is a concern or there's a problem, it's certainly one of those ones that I think to follow up on and make adjustments to in the future if necessary. Because I think that there might be a way to exclude the same volume of sightline by coming off of the curb, particularly on rounded curbs with just a few meters. It probably covers the same area. On pointed curbs, of which there aren't very many, I think, in the city, I think this makes a lot of sense. Very easy to measure. So it's really just those rounded curbs that I have the concern with. The other question I had, and again, I think it's a point for discussion so that we're aware of what we're debating and discussing here, is requiring the same, election signs of the same candidate to be at least 10 meters apart. Often in campaigns, very often in campaigns, people try to cover areas by putting kind of 3 posts and a sign that has a right angle, right, say on a corner, which would essentially be, I guess, 2 signs on a corner. And sometimes people also, for effect, double stack their signs, so they have the same sign on the same set of posts twice. I want to clarify that in the bylaw, that wouldn't be allowed, so that so that we fully understand, you know, that is essentially the rule that we're passing, so that those would be considered separate signs, even if they're on the same stake, and even if you had 3 posts, that those 2 signs together, even though they would kind of create one continuous viewpoint, would be 2 separate signs and not 1. If we could just clarify that so that I'm aware of what we're voting on.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the way it's worded in the bylaw, our interpretation would be those would be 2 signs. So we would suggest in that circumstance, the candidate use a 2-sided sign. So they have 1 sign with a sign on both sides, and then you can see it from both sides. But at this point, we would interpret that as 2 signs.
Okay, so I think that's another point of discussion for my colleagues, is if you're comfortable with that, that would be a change. You know, we can debate whether it's a positive change or not, but certainly that it will be one of the consequences of this new bylaws. You won't see those double stacked signs anymore, and you won't see those 90-degree kind of 2 signs at a 90-degree angle on some corners.
So just, if I could pick up on that a little bit. So is a 2-sided sign 1 sign or 2 signs?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if you have a sign on 2 posts and 1 sign, and it's double-sided, that would be 1 sign. If you have a sign with a post and another sign with a post in a triangle, that would be 2 sides.
Councilor Morgan, were those your points?
Yeah, we have other
Yeah.
guests here. I don't know if they
Yeah.
want to weigh in. Then I'm happy to enter in debate and comment on Councillor Helmer's comments as well.
Councilor Helmer, your point, the question you had was that you wanted to debate a little bit was, just remind me.
Whether we want to restrict signs to start at the end of the nomination period, or if we want to allow them at the beginning of the nomination.
Yeah, I'm really glad, if I may, from the chair for a minute, that you caught that one, because I think we have a shortened campaign period, if you will, from the opening of nominations, the 1st of May. And I think what we, in my view, we want to, we don't want to necessarily control the creativity of candidates. If they want to run a campaign a certain way, that's their prerogative. And I know in some jurisdictions, particularly I've been informed that out in BC, that it's quite restrictive. Not all that dissimilar to some of the provincial here. So I'd be interested in hearing around that. What is the appropriate? So the end of the nomination period is the end of July. And so that would leave you July, August, August, September, and October really for your campaigning. I'd like to hear from others if they feel that that's adequate, or should we, obviously there's no signs to be up before the nomination period opens. So what's the will of council on that? And perhaps before council weighs in on that, can you advise us of what other municipalities do across the province, Sarah, at all?
In Ontario, it's different in every jurisdiction, but it's much more prescriptive in cities such as Toronto, where there is a day in Ottawa rather close to the election where they dictate, it could be, I think it's 30 days prior to the election where they're allowed to place signs. So this we thought, again, we don't have the stats from the call center, but anecdotally from running 2 elections, the length that that signs are up are our #1 concern. So we thought this alleviated that concern with the 72-hour closing period and restricting it to the close of nominations in July rather than the opening in May.
And just say, can I ask just clarification? So just hypothetically, someone wants to take out a billboard in June. Would they be able to do that under your?
No, they wouldn't be able to do that. No, the only time it would be permitted would be on a campaign office. Billboards are restricted to the campaign, time after nomination day, or the close of nominations.
Thanks, and thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Chair. I was a few minutes late, so I don't know if anybody mentioned item, or section 2.5 in the bylaw. And in section 2.5, it refers to section 2.5, and I think it meant to be 2.4. Oh, it's fixed. Okay, good. I just wanted to point that out. As far as timing of signs, in my personal experience in the last campaign, I didn't put my signs up until Labor Day weekend. And I know that with the province now holding the set election dates, we will always follow a provincial election, and there is a lot of election fatigue out there. And I know in my own ward, one of the candidates was criticized for starting to put up his signs the day after the provincial election finished. So I'm fine with how the bylaw is written, but again, I'm open to hear from my colleagues, and again, it's a personal thing how an individual wishes to run their campaign, but from my experience, I didn't want to put it up too soon.
Okay, anyone else on let's just stay on that point, the timing thing. Michael?
Thank you very much. I think that would be fine for a councillor. For a mayor who has to cover the entire city in their campaign, that might be a factor.
Do we differentiate? I don't think we do. I saw a candidate with a sign out just 2 weeks ago.
So I'll weigh in on this. What we're essentially debating here is whether or not we want to double the amount of time that signs are available during the election period. So the time that has been recommended in the report allows for 3 months, slightly less because election day is a little bit before the end of the month, I think a few days. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll have to figure that out eventually. And adding another 3 months to the nomination period. So I think that's what we're talking about. We're also talking about all signs in this case. And I know that I actually have a difference of opinion for the road and boulevard signs, of which I know, is public space and shared by everybody and people's private front lawn, personal property. And I think that there's no reason why people shouldn't be able to put up a sign supporting a candidate on their own property after that candidate has filed a nomination. I see a difference in this case and some merits in restricting it along the roadways. Again, that's public space and that's where people travel and that's where we get the complaints. I don't get a lot of complaints about people's private lawns during elections. People complain about the noise, sign pollution along our public roadways. And so is it possible to separate this out and deal with the public road allowances and road spaces and all the public space with, nomination day is the day you're allowed to put it on city property once it's equal and fair to everybody. But if someone wants to file early and their friends and neighbors and supporters want to put up a sign on their own private property on their own front lawn, why not allow them to do that? It kind of balances the two. And I'd just like our clerks to comment on whether that would be possible to do within the structure of this bylaw.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we certainly will undertake whatever direction council gives us. That would be a substantial rewrite to the bylaw, so we would need you to refer back for another round because we'd have to talk about private property and public property. And so certainly we can do that, but if you're going to do that, I would suggest it probably needs to come back in another cycle because I'd be concerned about the transparency of adding all that in at this point.
So I'd like to hear what my colleagues think about that balance, and I'd also like our clerks to comment on the timing for this to have to be implemented. What date do we actually have to have this sign bylaw locked down? Again, I'm not really excited about deferring it again, but if there's interest in trying to find this proper balance, then that's what's going to be necessary. So at what point, what is the urgency to passing the bylaw here?
Through you, Mr. Chair, this can wait for a while. To be quite frank, we're just trying to get our checklist done and get the stuff that we can get done, so we're not doing this at the same time we're trying to do other things. So as long as we have it in time for, if it's going to be May 1st, the date, then obviously we would need it before May 1st. The other concern I have is that we're hoping to start having some candidate information sessions starting this fall. So we're hoping to be able to provide this information to the any potential candidates at those sessions. So that's partly why we are bringing it forward at this point.
Yeah, if I could be helpful, I think, this is kind of the second go-round. If we have some refinements that are, that one might need a little bit of tweaking to it. But let's get the checklist, this one off, so that we start to communicate. So if there's some tweaking and it has to come back around in early October or something like that, but let's not drag it into December, or January or whatever. So let's kind of wrap it up and make this the final tweaks to it. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. So just a point to add to this debate. If we're talking about private property, and if I move towards 7, I could support Councillor Morgan. I'm a pretty creative person. I might just want to make my own sign and put it up supporting someone like that. So how would we as a city be able to regulate that? I don't know if we can, so.
That is true. It'd be outside the ward, so we'd be regulating that. But the Municipal Elections Act does regulate it, and now that they require any publications of signs, so if someone's promoting a candidate, they're required to register with us as a third-party advertiser, so there would be some regulations there as well, and because now there are changes to the Municipal Elections Act, there'll have to be a disclaimer on each of the signs saying that it's supported by this candidate and the contact information for the candidate, or if they register as a third-party advertiser so that they can advertise on your behalf, they're required to register with us and file financial statements.
So, what do you call it when someone lets the cat out of the bag on a TV series? A bit of a, what is it? Yeah, so all of the signs that candidates have stored from previous elections that don't have those little, will they have to basically reprint them all? Or is this just third parties?
Those signs will need to have the contact information on them, but not to make a suggestion to how someone could run a campaign, but it could be just I believe a simple sticker notifying, like saying this sign was approved by candidate such and such.
Okay, so we've talked about that. Councillor Morgan, this is kind of your baby on this one in terms of the timing of it. Would you like to crystallize that in a suggestion for staff or a recommendation in terms of the sign timing?
Yes, well, let me make it clear, because I haven't heard from all of my colleagues on this yet. Yes, my thoughts on this are, I understand that the public roadway, of which all of us have responsibility and ownership for, it is reasonable to restrict the amount of time that we're gonna have sign pollution along our streets. But if I or someone else files as a candidate and someone wants to put something up on their private property to support me, I think that should be allowed the day that that person files. So when they have filed their papers, they can go and have their neighbor or their parents or their friends or whoever, or themselves, put up a sign on their private property. So I would like to see this differentiated between private property and the city's property and the city's road allowances. to be dealt with slightly different. And I would love, I don't mind moving that motion, but again, I know we're at committee, so I want to make sure that I'm not wasting anybody's time and that my colleagues are relatively supportive of that particular direction.
Okay, well, just from an efficiency point of view, the clerk has heard you and is drafting some language, and you're going to move that, and then I think the whole thing will have to go back, so we'll be referring it back with these sort of comments for administration to integrate into a bylaw that will come back to us at a future date. I think that's a reasonable one. The other one, Councillor Morgan, that you had was the two sign, one sign deal, and I don't know if we have Ms. Saunders, do we have a way to address that concern?
Apologize, I missed the question. I apologize, I missed the question. Could you repeat it for me, please?
The perpendicular angled sign where the two faces are being seen from different directions and the backs really are not being seen.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we'd have to put an exemption in the bylaw that said that under that case, they wouldn't be considered two separate signs if that's what council wishes us to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have just a question for Councillor Morgan through you, just for clarification. The adjustment, the change, the amendment to private versus public property, that's only regarding the timing, but not the location. So they would still have to be in the ward. So your parents have to live in your ward in order to show. Okay.
Yes, my mom's a constituent.
Okay, is there a motion on the two sign, one sign issue? Councillor Morgan.
I don't have a problem with that. I don't mind leaving that as is. If someone else wants to make that motion, they can. My main concern was the one I addressed. I will flag for my colleagues when we move on to that. What I do want is the clerks to take a look at the cornered thing, or the way that we measure off of corners again if there's more time. I wasn't interested in delaying the bylaw if we're going to have another cycle. I would like to have them look at that when they bring it back. If you want me to explain what I mean by that, I can now, but I don't want to muddy the current amendment.
Yeah. I think we're good. I'm certainly not interested. I think there's a way of doing your signs in such a way that it will work. And I think we get away from, I remember one councillor with some very large signs that were 4x8, two of them high. So there was actually 4x8s on a couple of corners, and that's over the top. So I think we're good on that. Okay. Let's see what we've got on the screen. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you. I think it's good enough in the sense that it's giving the direction we need to have the changes come back. For the ease of enforcement, I think having one day where you can put signs up is easier than the enforcement people knowing when everyone filed their papers, and like it would be very hard from a practical perspective to enforce that. So, if you write it in a way that says it's after you filed your papers, then I think they're going to have to know you filed on June 7th. And so if you had to sign up on June 5th, that was too early. And, there's other rules that prevent you from, for example, spending money before you're a candidate. So, I think just having it be a fixed date, which is the start of the campaign period. I know it's May 1, but rather than writing May 1 in, just having some kind of reference that could survive changes to legislation, that would probably be better. I don't think we actually need to change this motion. It's fine.
Ms. Saunders.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to clarify, I had in my notes about a possible definition of nomination day. Were we to include that in?
Yeah, it's there in that motion. I think it is helpful because it's still the date for the public signs.
Well, just for efficiency, why don't I call the question on this and then you can add something? Or do you want to just hold tight?
Well, then, for information, usually what happens at committee is this becomes everything. So I just don't want to pass this if we've done everything and then it's done.
Why don't you add whatever? I thought you were done. Go ahead.
No, and I don't know if you can turn on the old overhead for me while I'm talking. I want us to take another look while we have some time at not as we have some time now, I mean as we have some time with the cycle, at this 7 meters at the intersections, particularly on rounded corners. I don't care on corners that have a 90-degree turn. I do care on corners that have curves. And if I can, if the committee will indulge me, I want to just put up a little diagram on the thing. Here, I'll let you put it up. Yes, I'm using an overhead projector. I'm not using a spreadsheet this time, though.
Just to clarify, that's an overhead projector? I haven't seen one of those.
It's a digital overhead projector. It's high tech. Can you turn it 90 degrees the other way? Yeah, and then slide it down?
And then round the corners.
Yeah, slide, yeah. Okay, so here we have an intersection. It's a rounded intersection. So what I've drawn here is just a rough 7 meter by 7 meter site triangle. And we also are restricting 3 meters off of the roadway. So what I want you to look at is it even relevant to have the 7 meter triangle apply to rounded corners? In other words, does the 3 meters probably cover it anyways? Because what I don't want is someone standing at the 90-degree point of that triangle in the middle of the street, trying to measure out 7 meters each way to try to follow our bylaws and have someone standing on the street. If we can just look to see if we can handle rounded corners with just the distance away from the roadway and whether that is fine in the bylaw, I think that will cover it. And if it does, then the 7 meters on a rounded corner is irrelevant. So that's what we don't need to provide a direction, but when you bring back the bylaw, can you just make sure that we're not providing a situation where we're going to have someone figuring out if they can follow the rules by standing in the middle of the street with a tape measure, or at least in the street part of that rounded corner, to try to figure out where the 7 meter triangle is. And if I'm misinterpreting what we're doing at all with this diagram, please let me know, because this is the way that I understand someone would try to figure out on a corner what the site triangle is that they're allowed in. And I list the 3 meters because we also have another part of the bylaw that says you have to be 3 meters off of the edge of a roadway anyways. So that's what you see there. And I just want to make sure that if there's a way to not have people standing on the road, that we try to achieve that in the bylaw.
I was afraid we were going to Pythagorean theorem to figure out the midpoint of the hypothesis. So, Ms. Saunders?
Through Mr. Chair, Mr. McGuire would like to weigh in at some point. I just wanted to indicate that we did, in fact, look at doing this as part of a review, and we did have some difficulties and some concerns raised by some members of the review team defining it. We have some streets that don't have curbs. So, but, you know, we certainly will be going back and looking at this from a safety perspective. And we understand and the concerns you raised, and we did look at this, but we had some issues trying to define it clearly.
Mr. McGuire, is there an engineering solution?
Through the chair, I'm not sure it's an engineering solution, but just practice from our own employees where we hire a lot of students. And again, we don't want them out on the road. So we do have ways that they can measure, either projecting, because they're down the side of the street, and we'll measure from where the tangent portion of the curb is, so they're always out on the boulevard. So there really is no need to step out onto the road. That being said, if there is a crosswalk, they could still use the crosswalk as an area to measure from. But I think it can be done.
Counselor?
I respect that, and I know how to do that, and I know that our staff who are trained know how to do that. What I'm worried about is a campaign team volunteer who's asked to go put up a sign who doesn't know how to do that. So I respect what the clerk has said. I know that it's been looked into. With the additional time, I just want us to take a second look at it. If we cannot find a solution that is easy to understand, I think we deal with it in the communications and the training to the candidates. But since we have a little more time, for safety's sake, I want to make sure that we've covered all the bases to find a way that a campaign volunteer doesn't feel like they need to be out there with a piece of chalk and a measuring tape trying to measure 7 meters and draw a triangle. Because although that sounds silly, there are consequences to the bylaw now. And I anticipate campaigns will be very clear with their volunteers that we want you to follow the rules because we don't want to get a sign taken down and a fine and that sort of thing, which the punitive measures of the bylaw are important, but they can also lead to consequences of people really wanting to follow the rules, which is our intent. I just don't want an unintended consequence of volunteers being in a space that is not the best space for them to be.
Okay. So you're going to refer that piece back, Counselor? Yeah. Counselor Van Holst?
Thank you, and through the chair, it might be helpful for us to just have a diagram on a piece of graph paper so we could see meters and how that would look. And then it should be very clear.
Okay. All right. Anything further on this matter? Okay. Failing that, I'll look for mover and seconder.
For clarity, the recommendation before us has incorporated a number of pieces, and including the most recent discussion. So Part A would be provision for election signs to be put up on private property within the candidate's electoral ward as early as the start of the campaign period, but not on public property any earlier than nomination day. Staff are also to look at the easiest and safest way possible for campaign volunteers to ensure they are properly measuring the placement of signs. Amendments to clauses 2.4 and 2.5, which incorporate the reference to electoral district and the proper clause references, and the addition of 3 new definitions, one for electoral district, one for nomination day, and one for writ of election.
Counselor?
Thanks for reading that back. So I agree with Councillor Morgan about his concern. What I don't agree with is necessarily that it needs to be in the bylaw or that any changes need to be made to the bylaw. So right now, the way this reads is that the revised proposed bylaw will incorporate the easiest and safest way. I think it would probably be easier to just be noted that staff will look at this. We can talk about it again. I think in the time in between, we can figure out what, and I think it's going to be on the communication side of things, because really you have to follow the most restrictive rule possible, and on a curved road, it's probably going to be 3 meters and not the site triangle, and you'll be fine. But, I think we need to think about how that would be communicated more than changing the rules in the bylaw. Yes, that you shouldn't put one in the site triangle, and yes, it should be 3 meters back. I think those should stay the way they are. So I just think it needs to be slightly rewritten. Thank you for the clerk for reading that out.
Yeah. The clerk is capturing that. I agree with that. And, my experience, and just kudos to our staff on this, we all have volunteers and we all have, rookie candidates, and things go sideways sometimes. And I know our staff have not been draconian about it. They've always been informing and giving people heads up, hey, your sign at such and such is offside, could you do this or do that? Or even if they pick it up, hey, pick your sign up and it's here. So the idea here is to really help candidates and keep people safe. So I think these are good adjustments, and let's just keep the sort of the big picture in mind here. I have a seconder. I'll call the question.
Motion carries 3-0.
I have no other items. Is there any added business at this point? No? Seeing none, I'll take a motion to go in camera. Counselor Helmer.
And the reason for in camera is as posted on the agenda, items C1 and C2.